So, somebody said to me just now, he makes it seem so simple. Somebody else once said, it's all common sense. The trouble is, it's sense uncommonly applied. In other words, we don't do it. And there are reasons for that. It's to do with the way that we're wired and the way that we have become as a species. And it's really good to talk about that, because it does sound simple when you express it as you do, Ken, and yet we know that individually, collectively, and as a species, we tend not to do the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And we end up, ourselves, many of us, being, if not quite like Trump, nevertheless exhibiting the same kind of behaviours under pressure in our families, in our communities, in our churches, let's face it. The church is not conflict-free, I don't think. So let's talk about what it is about us that leads us to behave as we do when we sit here and we think, my goodness me, it's so obvious. What is it about who we are as people? Because I think we understand that, and understand ourselves better, and those with whom we might have conflict, we might then begin to understand what we can do about it. Will you talk us through that a little bit?
Okay. There's a lot here that we can talk about, but I think there's one simple point. Einstein said that you should make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do here. The simple point is basically this. What is a conflict? What creates conflict inside of us? And one answer to this is the assumption that there is a single truth. In a situation when in fact there are multiple truths. So, for example, the law is a way of taking two truths and deciding which one of them is the correct one. Well, one approach that I think is useful in thinking about, can you hear me in the back? Is that all right? Am I speaking loud enough? One approach that is useful to this is to think about what would happen if you did this in your family. If you assumed that one person was telling the truth and the other person was lying. Instead, what I think is more useful is to say that everyone is telling their truth, and that truth isn't the same for each person. So, for example, right now, you are looking in this direction, and I'm looking in that direction. We're seeing entirely different things. There's a famous story about, from India, about two groups of people who disagreed with each other and were having fights with each other, and a man painted one half of his hand red and the other half blue, and stood between them and said, "What color is my hand?" One group said red, the other group said blue, and they argued back and forth, and then they just switched it and showed them that what they were looking at was just a different side of the same hand. And we can say that that is true about us as well. We were talking before about stories and about the stories that we tell. And every conflict can be summarized in the form of a story. So there are actually three stories in the story that we tell. First, there is the external story that we tell other people. There is the internal story we tell ourselves. And then there is what I think of as the core story, which is the reasons why we made up those other two stories. Okay? And we make them up because there's a deeper story that needs to be told. And the deeper story is who we are, what we've experienced, what has happened to us in our lives, what we need and aren't getting, our deepest desires, our deepest fears, our deepest loves. Those are the things that actually create a great deal of the conflict between us. So we think of our story as essentially the story. This is going back to your question, which is what is it about us? We construct the world from the inside out, from that core story outward. But what I think we have to see, as I was saying earlier about stories, when we were talking about it, here's my way of thinking about it in terms of conflict stories. Every conflict story takes the form of an accusation against someone else. That's the conflict part of the story. Beneath every accusation is a confession. Beneath every confession is a request. Now, let's take an example. You are lazy. Okay, that's an accusation. What's the confession? The confession is, I'm working really hard here, and I'd like some help, and you aren't chipping in. And I'm getting upset about this, because it feels to me like you don't care about me, and about the way that I'm working here. And so I'm jealous of you for being able to take the time off, and I'm resentful of you for not helping me do this. That's a pretty complex story. But that's much more interesting and valuable than you are lazy. If you say you are lazy, what you're going to get in response is, no, I'm not, and you're something else, right? You're compulsive, slave driver, bossy, whatever it might happen to be. That's the confession. What's the request? Can you give me a hand? You are lazy equals, can you give me a hand? Right? So what you can see is that that's sort of the simplicity of it. So why don't we just say, can you give me a hand? And the reason is because we want it so badly. Meaning, somebody could say, I'm not going to help you because I really don't care about you. And we don't want to face that possibility. We don't want to necessarily become open and emotionally vulnerable in the presence of somebody who doesn't respect us. And so instead we take the safe route, which is to say something about them instead of saying something about us. It becomes a you statement instead of an I statement. And in between a you statement, which will always produce you are whatever, will produce no, I'm not, and you're a counterattack against you. You can make an it statement. The it statement is, there's a lot of work to be done. How should it be divided? Right? And then there could be a we statement. This is our house that needs to be cleaned. What tasks do you want to take on? How should we share those tasks between us, right? Each of those is exactly the same in content to you are lazy, but it'll be much more successful. So the first thing is, whether people are politicians or not, they're still people. And as people, we're all pretty much constructed in similar ways. We experience similar emotions, we have similar feelings, our feelings get hurt, we protect ourselves, we defend ourselves in various ways. And so, once again, what's important is to not separate ourselves from other people and think that they are the ones who are the problem, but instead to find the commonality, to look for the thing that connects us. And then what we can say is, in some cases you can scale up, meaning you can go to higher levels. But what truthfully is, what is happening is that there's a difference between resolving conflicts between individuals and resolving conflicts within systems. And if you have a system, which can be a family system, a social system, a political system, an organizational system, a church is an organizational system, right? And it's set up in certain ways that we don't really look at, we don't pay much attention to. But there is a whole area of conflict resolution that is called conflict resolution systems design, which is an approach to trying to structure systems in ways that allow for problems to be solved more effectively. For example, how do problems get solved in your families? Well, one way is for there to be one person who's the boss in the family. That's one way of doing it. And if everybody's okay with that, that will be fine, but nobody is ever completely okay with that. So there are difficulties that arise as a result. So then maybe what happens is there is a family meeting where people sit down and they talk about the problem and they figure out what they're going to do about it. Everybody is heard, everybody participates in it, and then you reach consensus. Many years ago in Japanese management, this was called going slow to go fast. So you stop, you talk about it, and then you figure out what you're going to do about it.
And that was in an organisation?
At an organizational level. In a church, you would say, how do decisions get made inside of churches? How do we participate in doing this together, and at the same time allow each of us to be individuals, to have our own views, and to have that clash. Because here's the real truth about conflict. It's actually an incredibly important, constructive, positive force. Out of the conflict emerges a better way of doing things, because you can now appreciate what a problem was for somebody that wasn't taken into account before. You can include that. So where are you going to go on vacation? You're going to go north, or you're going to go south? You're going to go to the ocean, or you're going to go to a lake, or to the mountains, or wherever it is. You're going to go to the city. Where are you going to go? Well, everybody's going to have a different view of this, and what you want to do is, the goal of the vacation is for everybody to have a good time. But if one person decides and everybody else is miserable, they're not all going to have a good time. And those of you who have children know that your children can make it miserable for you, right? You want to have this great family occasion, and now the whole thing just completely falls apart because they didn't have a voice. And so what's important is for families to, on a small scale, come together and have these conversations with each other and try to reach consensus on what they're going to do. Maybe there's going to be a rotation. Now, how are governments and large-scale social organizations differ from that? Well, in the first place there's a question of size. And there's some professor, I think at Oxford, who has written that the largest size that human beings can feel that they're connected to is about 250 people. And that's it. So what we do instead is we simplify, and instead of there being just 250 people, there could be a group of thousands or a group of millions even, but it's one group, right? So we can interact with North Korea, as something that exists, and that's just one thing. But what we have to see is that conversations are different the more people get added to the conversation. So we know that it's very different one-on-one, for 3, for 4, for 5, and for a group like this. The more people you add to the conversation, the more the conversation begins to change. So what we do, and what John and I are working on, is the development of dialogue techniques, which include small group conversations. And the basic idea here is any real conversation should break down so that at each of your tables, you each have the conversation so that everybody can participate. Everybody gets to have their say. Everybody listens to everybody else. And then what happens is you're able to reach an agreement at your table about what you want, Then you report out to the group as a whole, and then we try to reach agreement in the group as a whole. So you start small and then start growing larger.
So,
Now, yeah.
I was going to pause you, because is it okay to pause at this stage?
Well, just to follow up on one thing, which is kind of, this was your question as well. Is this going to be successful? Can we really do this? And in a way, this is kind of behind your question as well, I think, Wolf. Truthfully, I think there are two answers to this. One, I don't think we have a choice. I think we have to keep trying to do this, because if we don't, it's just not going to succeed. The world has become closely connected at the same time that the weapons that we have become incredibly more powerful and available. And if we think now about not just 10 years, but 50 years, 100 years, every country on the planet could develop a nuclear weapon. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We've got to figure out a different way of doing this. And I think on a whole bunch of different levels, when we look at climate change, when we look at species extinctions, when we look at population explosion, we look at a whole series of different issues, basically, we are approaching these issues from the point of view, as Donald Trump says, America first. But if everybody does that, and nobody's looking out for the planet, it's going to fail. We know that that's the case.
And it is the future of our species.
Yes.
Because as you said yesterday, climate change, disease, and other global threats know no boundaries. They don't stop at the border.
Yes.
Even if you put a wall up.
Exactly.
I would like to ask Ken about reconciliation and forgiveness. In this church last weekend, Mike preached the sermon on that topic of forgiveness and reconciliation. And I'd like to explore with you really what comes after all we've been talking about here. What do we do with people who have hurt us, by whom we feel hurt, who detest us, by whom we feel detested? What do we do with our own anger and pain, and where in your work does forgiveness sit, and how does it work in your work? And it may be in a non-theological sense, but I'm interested in the interplay between your experience and observation about forgiveness and theology, and maybe that also brings us into that essential need for healing, that biblical call, but also in the way you describe it, that human call for us to heal and to come together. Talk to us a little bit about that, Ken.
So if we assume that conflict is a kind of wound to our relationships, and a wound that occurs internally inside of each of us, and if there's a division that has taken place, we're now separated. What are the stages of processing that and bringing people back together again? And we can see basically there are 6 stages. 1, stop the fighting. Okay? That's just critical. You have to stop fighting in order to do something. How do you stop the fighting between kids on a playground? You separate them, right? So we can just separate people and say, calm down. But if that's all you do, you haven't really taken care of the fundamental problem. You've stopped the fighting, which is good, important. There's a ceasefire. Now what? Well, now you have to actually bring them back together again in order to settle the issues. First step, stop the fighting. Second step, settle the issues. Talk about what are the issues between you. The third step is more difficult. The first 2 are pretty obvious. The third one requires a lot more skill, and each of these requires more skill. Separating kids on the playground is pretty simple compared to having a conversation to settle our differences, or settle the issues. The third level is to resolve the underlying reasons that gave rise to that dispute, to those issues, and will continue to generate new issues until it's resolved. Conflicts between siblings, brothers and sisters, fighting with each other over whatever it is. Well, you can take the individual issue and settle it, but it's not going to stop the underlying tension between them. So you've got to resolve the underlying issues. That's relational and it's emotional, but it's deeper and more profound. More deeply than that, what we have to do, if you stop the fighting, you settle the issues, you resolve the underlying reasons, are you done yet? And the answer is no, because what's left over is your memory of what they did. How do you process the memory of what they did? Well, if you haven't stopped the fighting, it's hard to get there, or settle the issues, it's hard to get there, or resolve the underlying emotional issues. But once you've done those things, then what you have to do is to come to a place where you come to terms with what happened, and this is the place of forgiveness. Deeper than forgiveness, in my view, is something even harder to address. And it's basically this. If you ask yourself, you can ask yourself this question. When somebody treats you badly, what is the very first part of you that shuts down? And what is the very last part of you that opens up again? For me, it's my heart. My capacity for caring about them. Okay? So I stop caring when I feel attacked. The last part of me to open up again is my ability to care about them, care for them. That's the heart. That's reconciliation, as I see it. Until you get to reconciliation, you're not completely done with the conflict. Meaning, think of it this way. When you are in the argument, what percentage of your life energy is dedicated to that argument? And the answer is a lot. Maybe 100%, maybe for some people 150%, and they're really seriously going into deficit spending here. So now, what do we do about that? Well, when you stop the fighting, you get some energy back. And that energy that you get back allows you to calm down and start to look at the issues. And when you settle the issues, you get some energy back, and that allows you to look at the underlying reasons that gave rise to your conflict. And when you do that, then you get some energy back that allows you to get to a place of forgiveness. So what is forgiveness? Here are two definitions. I'll give you mine, and then I'll give you a better one. My definition of forgiveness is releasing yourself from the burden of your own false expectations. What you wanted it to be like, who you wanted them to be, right? Giving up your expectations of who they were going to be, letting them be themselves. There's a better definition by a writer whose name is Annie Dillard. She says, forgiveness is giving up all hopes of having a better past. Okay, is that good? All hopes of having a better past. And this is really what it is. Forgiveness, once the conflict is in the past, then it becomes a question of why are you holding on to it? What's in it for you? And the answer is exactly nothing. Meaning there's nothing that's going to come from holding on to something that is just over. If it isn't over, then you have a different problem. How to stop it from continuing. But once it's over, then the question is reaching forgiveness. But for some people, it becomes possible to reach forgiveness at a deeper level that prevents you from getting into the conflict to begin with. That's sainthood.
Can I pick up on both of the forgiveness and reconciliation stages? Going to forgiveness, to what extent, in your analysis of things, and leaving the theology aside for just now, is forgiveness necessarily and inevitably a reciprocal transaction? And to what extent is it something which you can achieve unilaterally,
yes,
on your own account, without reference to the response
correct,
of the other?
You can do this by yourself. The other parts you can't do by yourself. But the last two, forgiveness and reconciliation, you can do by yourself. The true definition of sainthood is having a heart that is continuously open, I think. To me, this is what it really is. A heart that is open without conditions, unconditionally open-hearted. That's what Marie is, what's her name? Teresa.
Mother Teresa?
Huh?
Mother Teresa?
Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just somehow
Saint Teresa.
Well, that's what I started to say.
Saint Teresa.
Yeah. So, how do you get to this place of forgiveness within yourself?
Yeah.
I think there are 5 steps. And we can then say there are 10, there are 25. I mean, you can break it down in different ways. But here I think are the basic 5. First step, remember what happened to you and how it felt. So you've all heard the phrase, forgive and forget. The problem is that if you really forget, you give permission for it to happen again. So we don't really want to forget what happened. What we want to do is to remember, and in the face of that memory, to choose what our attitude is going to be toward what hurt us. And that's really fundamental to the forgiveness process. Second, imagine as deeply as you can what must have happened to the other person and how they must have felt. Why? Because when you get into conflict, the very first thing that happens is you treat the other person, cast them out. You shut down your own capacity for empathy and compassion out of self-defense. You can't be empathetic anymore to them. So recreating your own capacity for empathy and compassion is really important.